Hello. So we are going to continue with the social and intellectual background of Victorian poetry. And in this lecture, which is the third one in this series, I'm going to talk about the Industrial Revolution, the industrialization of Britain during the Victorian age, and try to see what effect it might have had on the Victorian poetry. So, as you know, before the Victorian age, it was the Romantic age where industrial revolution had already started, and under Queen Victoria's reign the industrialization of Britain rose to its height. Now that industrialization brought with it several changes that are very important in terms of social and intellectual development that had happened in this age. Now we are going to talk about these changes and we'll see whether these changes had any reflection in the poems. Now the first change that happened during this period was the rural to urban society. Now as you know, in the pre-Victorian period, Britain mainly consisted of the rural population, and it was a kind of an agrarian economy. Now, under Queen Victoria's reign, it was a period of rapid industrialization, and with it came tremendous change and an expensive growth of England's both domestic and foreign power. Now, what happens when there is industrialization of one's country? The factories are always set in the city, it grows up first in the city. So the same thing happened in Britain. The factories were set up in London, and there was a huge influx of population from the country to the city. That happens whenever there is an industrial process going on. Now, historians say that there was so huge a population influx that happened from country to the city that cities in Britain now had about 80% of the country's population. Now, as you know, as you can understand, this will bring about several negative consequences with it too, and that those were some horrifying slums that were there in London, overcrowded London streets, and on the other side deserted villages. Now all of these has their own reflection in Victorian literature, like the case about horrifying slums, overcrowded streets can be found in Dickens. There is a very popular poem called The Deserted Village by Oliver Goldsmith, I think, but we are kind of keeping these texts out of today's discussion because we are mainly focusing on Victorian poetry. Now Dickens, when he wrote about these problems, it was the novel, and Oliver Goldsmith Deserted Village came out in 1770. So that is outside our age, so we are kind of not discussing bringing those texts into discussion today. The second change that happened was the rise of the middle class. Now previously it was the aristocracy, as I told you during the discussion of the class structure in Victorian society. The aristocracy was the highest class, and they owned both land, which was the main source of wealth, and also the titles, and that is why they controlled the policies of both the domestic and foreign policies of Victorian Britain. Now with the rise of the middle class, and this middle classes were actually the business owners, and now they accumulated a huge amount of wealth. They controlled this huge wealth, and now they were beginning to buy lands for their businesses. Now with that, the aristocracy, when they bought their lands was left with only the titles. But now both the lands and the concentration of wealth were being increasingly controlled by the middle class. This was another change. The third one is, as you know, which also I discussed in the first lecture. This was an era of scientific and technological progress. It was an age of technology, it was an age of industry and engineering progress, and with that progress, behind that progress, one main reason was the steam engine. And as Dickens writes again in Christmas Carol, that the steam engine making travel faster, output greater, and precision finer. This was progress on one side. But along with that progress, there were some negative consequences too of this technological or industrial progress. The biggest being the working class suffered in this age. And working class, as I've said, they consisted of as much as 80% of the country's population. They suffered because they were having long work hours, like 12 to 14 hours of work a day. They worked in very poor working conditions. They had low wages, no security of either health, no security of job, and they were often forced to abandon their children. Now, this whole thing again is best reflected in Charles Dickens. We have texts like Hard Times, we have texts like David Copperfield, and again we are leaving those out from today's discussion because this is mainly about Victorian poetry. The poor working class, they also suffered because they had very poor living conditions, they had very poor sanitation, no running water, very little ventilation. They lived in clusters in highly overpopulated slums, and it resulted in malnutrition, deaths, and several diseases very often broke out that killed mostly children. Some very serious diseases like cholera or smallpox broke out. Now, what effect do everything this era of progress had on Victorian poetry? Now, for sure, I'm not too sure about Browning when it comes to this, but we see the reflection of this industrialization of England in Tennyson's Ulysses. If you have read the poem, you'll see that there is a line that it's not too late to seek a newer world, which is there in Ulysses. Now you have to remember that in the Romantic Age, like the Romantic Age, where William Wordsworth was the poet laureate of England, after Wordsworth's death, it was Lord Tennyson that who was appointed as the poet laureate of England in this age. And the poet laureate of England are appointed by the monarchy, and as a poet laureate, therefore, they had to kind of propagate the official doctrine that the monarchy believed in. And thus, it was on Tennyson to propagate this official doctrine of Victorian progress and change. And change in several ways, like social, cultural, to a world of science and technology. These changes, which I talked about, got very serious reflection in Tennyson's Ulysses, and that is what he means with consideration to one interpretation, the newer world. And this Victorian world of progress was the newer world that Tennyson was probably hinting at. And in the same poem, Tennyson's Ulysses, there is also another line, is how dull it is to pause to make an end. And this again was, according to one interpretation, the relentless world of Victorian progress. Now, this phrase should bring back memories of Charles Lamb's superannuated man, because this is a phrase that I used in superannuated man. Now, the change that we have to consider here is that when I use this phrase in superannuated man, it had very negative connotation, because industrialization and industrial progress, that culture in the romantic, for the romantic, does bring negative connotation and they are against it. But for the Victorian poet or the Victorian writers, it was not negative. And this relentless world of Victorian progress is something that Tennyson celebrates. And with this, the momentum of life, it's a call to action. Tennyson tells us that a life of action is the best life, and that is exactly what Ulysses stands for, a life of relentless progress. So these are some interpretations of Tennyson's Ulysses that is possible. And of course, we'll go into the details when we do Ulysses as a poem. But I planned on doing this lecture on Industrial Revolution because this is one very important interpretation of the poem Ulysses. So with that, I come to the end of this lecture. We'll continue again in the next session. Thank you.